Okay, before I talk too much about that, I want to cover something that gets thrown around a lot, and that is if you need to plant native or non-native plants. And first of all, I am not a purist, and so I will say you plant whatever you like and whatever will grow in your landscape and whatever the bees like, and that's all you need. Thank you. And so I'm by no means one or the other. I think there's room for everything. But if you are talking about native, you have to ask yourself, well, native to what? Native to Dodge County, native to Nebraska, native to the Great Plains, native to the United States. And so really you need to identify that when you're talking about starting any sort of landscape, and if you want to be quote unquote native, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? So if a if a plant or an insect or a mammal of any type is endemic, that means that it's found in some sort of defined geographic location. And it can be big or small, but in that location, that's where it is endemic to. And on the other opposite end, or the other side of that coin, I guess, would be cosmopolitan, in which whatever species we're talking about has a distribution that is found everywhere or usually worldwide. So this would be one example of something that maybe in the green you can see the plant or the insect is found in these locations. And so while the United States is pretty much covered and parts of Europe and into China, this species of whatever it is found, the geographic location is obviously very different. However, the latitude in the hemisphere is relatively similar, which is why things like plants native to China will do usually quite well in Nebraska, generally speaking. And so it's not necessarily native strictly to the United States, but it is considered or would be considered native if it had a spread like what you see on the screen. If we start to zero in and maybe said plant or said insect is only found in these states that are shaded green, that would be a much smaller area that the species is endemic to, but it could still be considered native to the United States, just maybe only the eastern side. And it would still be like, say, for example, if this was like some sort of maple species, a maple tree. The genetics in the north end part of this range would be different than the genetics found on the south end of this range, even though it's still a maple tree of whatever species we're talking about. And so that's why when sometimes you'll see or hear people talk about locally sourced seed or local source of whatever plant species that you're planting or growing, it usually means that it's been collected and grown wherever it's then going to be planted, because something that's been grown in Tennessee, adapted to living in Tennessee, is going to have a hard time making it up in Maine, even though maybe the range of the species can go up that far. It's going to be a lot different situation. And then if you go even farther down, say there's just one plant that's only been found in these 5-6 counties in Nebraska. So it's still technically native to Nebraska, but I think the people that are listening in the Panhandle will contest that their growing conditions is a lot different than those of us on the east side of the state and vice versa. And so something might be native to Nebraska, but it might only be native to the very southern eastern side of the state or the far west. And so again, it might not be necessarily the best plant choice for you, even though it is still a Nebraska native. So I really just encourage you to do your research whenever you're trying to add something that is native, Nebraska native, or Great Plains native, anything like that, just to make sure that you do know where it's native to. And to say that it's native to North America is not really enough. And then, of course, when we're talking about cosmopolitan and having a worldwide range, obviously the geographic locations are different, but also the growing conditions in the far northern parts of Canada down to the far south parts of Africa and overall into Australia. It's going to be completely different. That just means that that species is adapted to a very, very wide range of habitats. It could be temperature, it could be precipitation, it could be humidity, it's probably all of these things, but either way, that species can thrive in all situations. Okay, so when we're talking about creating a landscape specifically for pollinators, ideally we would have all of these things, but of course, you know, we don't live in an ideal world, and so we have to make concessions and do what we can. First of all, they need food, and so they need the large groups of flowers or plants that flower during 3 seasons. And it's really easy to have things that bloom in June, but it's maybe more harder, or you have to make a more concerted effort to have things that are blooming now, April, and then again in the fall, September, October. And that's really when pollinators are either building up in the spring, building up their populations, maintaining more so in the summertime, and then getting ready for winter into the fall. And of course, honeybees would be a perfect example of this, and they have these 3 season peaks of when they're really looking for forage resources. But it would be with all pollinators as well. A lot of the pollinator plants that we suggest for people to plant are sun plants or sun-loving plants, and that would be considered full sun, 6 hours or more a day of sunlight. And it's not so much because of the plants. There are some shade-loving or tolerant plants that are pollinator-friendly. It's more so for the pollinators because they are insects and their bodies don't warm up like ours do, and so they need that full sun to really be active. There are, like I said, those some shade plants, and we won't talk about specific plants tonight, but if you have questions, just email me and I can get you a list. Like all living things, pollinators need water, and that's a huge component, I guess, of having a really good landscape that's friendly to pollinators. And it doesn't have to be running water, just regular bird bath is fine, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Little to no chemical use, and that's not necessarily because pesticides are inherently bad. Like Jonathan already talked about, it's a tool. It shouldn't be the first tool that we go to, and it shouldn't be the only tool that we go to when there's a problem in our landscape. And I would encourage, first of all, everybody to relax. If you have a couple weeds in your yard, it's okay. There's bigger fish to fry, and then a couple dandelions. And so by doing that, you take some stress off of yourself, but then also provide food and floral resources for pollinators that need it, and maybe an otherwise completely turf-dominated landscape. Little or no chemical use is really just to ensure that the food that they're feeding on is not contaminated, and they're bringing back contaminants into either the hive or to their own nest if they're solitary. And so really just the less that you can use, the better. Native bee houses is a nice way to encourage native pollinators to inhabit your landscape and offer them nesting space that they may or may not have. We'll talk about nesting habitat a little bit more in a couple slides. Weeds are, fortunately or unfortunately, a really big part of a really good pollinator habitat. They're some of the best as far as providing the necessary proteins that insects need, pollinators specifically need, nectar as well. But there's just so many that are really good for pollinators that, again, you just need to just relax. It'll be okay. And again, I always prefer a mix of non-native and native plants. That's because not all of our pollinators are native. The first of which, or most important, would probably be the European honeybee. So by having non-natives as well as native plants, I feel like I'm feeding everybody, and also including plants that I just like to have in my landscape because I find them pretty. Protection from wind, it's not always the case in Nebraska, and it's certainly not always doable, but if you can, that would be ideal. And again, patches of bare soil, and that would be for the ground nesting bees that we'll talk about towards the end. So this would be just a couple examples of how to have water on hand for pollinators. They cannot swim, and so having a big pool of open water is not desirable. And so if you have anything like any of these that you see, rocks, pebbles, marbles, anything like that, it gives the insects something to stand on while they drink. It's important to remember, though, that this is standing water, and so not only will the pollinators utilize it, but so will the mosquitoes. And Jonathan, how long does it take for a mosquito egg to hatch?
Just a few days. I mean, you can have a generation in a couple of weeks.
A couple of weeks.
Right, yeah.
So every 7 days, I suggest
absolutely
cleaning out your water supply, whatever it is. Dumping it out, closing it down. If there's any eggs or anything like that, it's on the sides. You'll get that off that way, and then fill it back up. So they should always have fresh water, not necessarily because they can't drink or won't drink stagnant water, but because you want to not increase the population of mosquitoes.
What about bottled water from the spring?
Only French artesian water. So a lot of people want to talk about how pesticides are killing all of the insects. And like Jonathan said, that is definitely a layer. I heard somebody say death by 1,000 cuts.
Oh, I like that one.
I like that one. It's very like
Ninja-y.
Ninja-y, yes. But what I also really like to talk about is habitat loss, because you can be a completely organic acreage, but if you don't have the habitat, it's not going to matter. And so I encourage people to look at this picture and then the next picture that we're going to see after that, in 2 different scenarios where habitat has been lost for pollinators, other mammals, anything like that. So if you were to see this gorgeous cornfield anywhere in Nebraska or the surrounding states, it's going to feed a lot of things and a lot of people and do a lot of good. But if you are a bee and you live on that far side of the screen in those trees and you have to fly across the field to get any food, that's going to wear you out, first of all, and probably indirectly decrease your numbers of offspring. Is that fair? That's fair. However,
hey, Natalia.
Yes.
They didn't hear it was death by what?
1,000 cuts. Did you hear me that time?
Thank you.
Cuts. So this is a picture that I like to show for urban scenarios that also have little to no habitat. If you look at this landscape, this is a lovely home and very little, if any, flowering plants. So the turf is completely weed-free. The evergreen shrubs surrounding the house, possibly a maple tree on the right. I don't know what kind of tree that is. I can't tell, and I don't know where this house is. But it's definitely something that is as much a intensification of agriculture problem as it is an intensification of urbanization. And so anything that you do, no matter where you live, it's going to make a difference. That's my point. But no matter what situation that you're coming from, there's problems, but there's always solutions.
So I'm sorry to interrupt again. They did not understand what that term means. Death by 1,000 cuts.
Death by 1,000 cuts. It's just like Jonathan said, with the situation with pollinators being like an onion and there's a lot of layers, not one cut is the lethal item that's killing all the pollinators. They're dying because 1,000 things are happening against them. So this is the foraging area. I didn't realize it was blurry until I'm looking at it right now, but this is the foraging area for honeybees. And honeybees travel a lot farther from their hive than some of the other solitary bees. But this is just to give you an idea of how far they can fly. They prefer to stay in that 1 to 2 mile radius right around the hive. But if they don't have the floral resources that they need, they'll go farther. But when you say they can go up to like 4, 5, 6 miles away from the hive, 4, 5, 6 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when you think about that radius around the hive and how many acres that includes, then you're talking about a massive amount of floral space, or if they don't have habitat, it could be apartments, anything like that they're going to come into contact with. But if you look at the radius for just 1 mile, all around that hive, that would be about 2,000 acres. And so it's a fairly large space. And so I just want to caution people against thinking that if they have a hive, a backyard hive of honeybees or anything like that, and have a lot of flowers on their property and think that their honeybees aren't leaving their property. They are, trust me, because there's so many bees in that hive and they have so much mouths to feed that they have to leave. And so they are getting flower resource from other places, as well as, you know, where they are foraging right around their hive. There's been a lot of talk about putting in like pollinator strips for agriculture fields. And I think that generally that's good, but something like this, you know, would still provide nesting habitat and floral resources, especially with like plum bushes like this next to like a grassy area and maybe the fields on the other side. The bad thing about this is, or I guess something that you need to consider, is that the flowers and the plants that are in between these fields are still likely to be contaminated by pesticides that are used in the fields. And so I don't know if sometimes they're called a sink, and I don't know if would you say that they are good or bad?
It's a sticky wicket.
It's a complicated scenario. So you're still doing good in providing habitat, nesting habitat, as well as floral resources, pollen and nectar, but they are coming into contact with pesticides. So just keep that in mind whenever you see these mentioned. There's good and bad to everything, right? And it's the same way with the house. If it's, you know, something urban, chemicals are misused by everyone or anyone, and can be decreased by everyone and anyone. And the plant choices around your house, as well as if you have something more formal like a really nice putting green in your backyard, maybe something around your house immediately will be more for the pollinators and less for your golf game. The plants in this slide have a wide range, I think, of things that are beneficial for pollinators and some that are not quite so much and maybe are more for the gardener. And I think that's a great mix, and it's a lovely landscape. But you can see by the little gravel road on the bottom that there's some weeds in it. And so clearly not super concerned about tiny weeds or weeds here and there, or spending a whole bunch of time on weed control or turf control out in the gravel path, just to consider. A lot of homes, maybe more in the cities, are a little bit more, or expected to be a little bit more tidy and a little less wild, and that's okay. If we like take it off in like little bites, then we can like crouch in and take over eventually. But if you look at the house on the left and compare it to the house on the right, and it could be the same house, hypothetically speaking, just around the corner on the other side. If you see something like the front, that's fine and it's tidy and it's very neat looking. But there would still be opportunities to make it pollinator friendly. For instance, if you look at those looks like 4 shrubs right in the front, it looks like maybe 5. If you were to take those out and replace them with a simple shrub that's a pollinator friendly one, like New Jersey tea or something like that, that would still give you that overall landscape design and components of all of that and still look tidy, but would still also offer pollinator floral resources. And so I think that there's this misconception that you have to have a 5-acre prairie to make any difference, and that's really not true. Like Jonathan said, species found in urban settings, the diversity could be equal as what they are in rural settings. And my PhD research is on bees found in urban settings. And a lot of times, or at least what I found so far, is that there's some bees that are moving in from more agriculture settings because floral resources aren't there anymore, but they are finding them in town. And so any little bit you do can still help. And then on the right, there's a picture of a slope that should not be mowed because it's too steep and it's just a little spot. And they planted it to prairie plants, and I think that looks really great. And they maintain it, and you can't put in a prairie planting and not maintain, because you're still going to have weed issues, you're still going to have maintenance problems. It's not put in and leave. It's still a garden, and it's still something that you're going to have to look after to really make it look like it does in this picture.